He went hunting and captured an Apache woman. What happened next changed his life forever. The rope was still in my hand when I understood what I'd done. Not what I thought I'd done. Not what I set out to do, riding up into the Sonora hills that October with my Winchester and 3 days of dried venison, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who has spent too many years alone to expect much of anything anymore. I'd gone up there to hunt. Deer, maybe elk if I got lucky. That was all. That was the whole of it. But the rope was in my hand, and on the other end of it was a woman. She stood about 10 feet back from me, wrists bound together in front of her, and she was looking at me the way a hawk looks at the thing that's just caught it, not scared exactly. Something past scared. Something that had already decided what it was going to do when it got the chance. Her hair was black and loose, and there was blood drying on the side of her face from where she'd hit the ground when her horse threw her. The horse was gone. Spooked by a cougar, I figured, same cougar that had sent me crashing through the brush in the wrong direction, which is how I'd come around that rock shelf and nearly run her down. She'd had a knife. I'd had the rope. It wasn't something I planned. It was the kind of thing that happens in 4 seconds when 2 people surprise each other in rough country and both of them are running on instinct. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I have done things in my life I am not proud of. Things I don't talk about and don't intend to. But holding a woman against her will, that was not something I was going to do. The trouble was the knife. And the second trouble was that I didn't speak Apache, not more than a handful of words, and she didn't speak English. Or if she did, she wasn't showing it. And every time I moved to loosen the rope, she tensed up like she was about to put her head down and run. So I stood there in the Sonora hills in the thin October light with this woman on the end of a rope I didn't want to be holding, and I did the only thing I could think of. I sat down. Sat right down on a flat rock, set the rope across my knee without gripping it, and started cutting a strip of jerky with my belt knife. She watched me. I could feel it without looking up. I cut the jerky into pieces, set one on the rock beside me, and pushed it in her direction with the toe of my boot. Then I started eating mine. That was how it started, not with anything grand, with jerky on a rock and a man who was tired and a woman who was deciding whether to run. My name is Cal Rourke. I was 51 years old that October. I had been a cowhand in my 20s, a buffalo hunter in my 30s, a trapper and scout through my 40s. I had a line shack in the Sonora foothills that I'd built myself out of cedar and river stone, and a reputation in the town of Yucca Crossing for being the kind of man you hired when you needed to know what was in the hills and didn't much care whether the answer was pretty. I was not a man people sought out for company. I had 2 horses, a dog that died the prior spring, and enough supplies to winter alone without going to town more than once. I had not touched a woman in 7 years. I say that not to draw sympathy. I say it because it is the only way to explain what happened to me in the weeks that followed. Why a man who prided himself on being past needing anything found himself rearranging his whole life around the task of keeping one woman alive and safe, and not bolting. Her name, I learned later, was Nijoni. It means something like beautiful in Navajo, though she was Apache Chiricahua as best I understood it. I learned this piece by piece over many days, the way you learn anything from someone who has no reason to trust you and every reason not to. A word at a time, a gesture. A long look that meant no, a shorter one that meant go ahead. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That first afternoon on the rock shelf, the only thing I knew was that she was hurt, she was alone, and her horse wasn't coming back. I cut the rope. Just reached over and cut it. Didn't make a speech about it, didn't hold her eyes to let her know what a decent man I was. Just cut it, coiled the rope and put it in my saddlebag. Then I picked up my Winchester and started walking toward my camp, which was about a mile northeast through scrub oak and loose shale. I didn't look back. I heard her following me about 200 yards later. Camp was a ledge cut into a south-facing hillside, out of the wind, with a steep spring coming out of the rock about 30 feet to the left. I had a fire ring already laid. I got the fire going while she stood at the edge of the light and watched. I didn't speak, didn't gesture at her to come closer or stay back. Just went about the business of making camp the way I always did, deliberate, quiet, nothing wasted. After a while she came and sat on the far side of the fire. The blood on her face had dried dark. I had a piece of clean flannel in my kit, and I wet it from the canteen and set it on the flat stone between us. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and cleaned her own face, handed it back when she was done. That's the thing nobody talks about with Apache women. Everybody in Yucca Crossing had something to say about Apache, usually said loudly and with a great deal of confidence, usually by men who'd never spent a night in the hills they were talking about. What I saw, sitting across that fire, was a woman of about 35 who had assessed a bad situation, made a series of fast and intelligent decisions, and was now making another one. Whether the large, graying, rough-spoken man across the fire was a threat or a resource. I had the feeling, watching her eyes move over the camp, that she was taking an inventory. The supplies, the horse picketed to the north, the terrain on 3 sides, the exits. I let her look, went about my business. I fried salt pork and made cornbread in the pan, the way I'd done 1,000 times. The smell changed something in the air between us. When it was done, I cut the cornbread in half, put half in the pan lid and set it beside her. Then I ate from the pan. She ate clean and without hurry. I decided right then that I wasn't going to think too hard about any of this. In the morning, I'd figure out where her people were and get her back to them. In the morning, that would be the task. Tonight, the task was just this: fire, food, no trouble. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote started up, and then another, and she turned her head and listened to them without expression. Not afraid. Just listening, the way you listen to something that is talking about you in a language you know. I pulled my blanket around my shoulders. After a moment, she pulled her own blanket. She'd had one rolled behind her saddle, I realized, which meant the horse hadn't gone far, and she settled herself on her side of the fire. I slept with my rifle across my legs, same as always. In the morning, she was still there. I will not pretend I knew what I was doing in those first days. I did not. I was a man who had spent his whole adult life reading terrain and weather and animal sign, and here was something I could not read, and the not reading of it occupied my mind in a way that nothing had in longer than I could say. She stayed close to camp that first day. I went about my tasks, checked the horse, gathered more wood, cleaned my rifle, and she watched, not with the watchfulness of someone who is waiting to run, with the watchfulness of someone who is figuring out a system. By midday, I understood that she was not going to let me take her anywhere. She was going somewhere herself in her own time for her own reasons, and she had decided that my camp was where she would stay until she was ready to go. I don't know how I understood this. I just did. There are things you can read without language. Late in the afternoon, I shot a jackrabbit on the hillside above camp, and when I came back, she already had a fire going. She had also found a clay seam in the hillside near the spring and dug out a small amount of it, mixed it with something from a pouch she wore at her belt, and was pressing it into a crack on the sole of her right boot. She worked with the concentration of someone who has been solving practical problems since she was a child. Which, of course, she had been. I cleaned the rabbit. She took it from me, no ceremony, just a practical extension of a hand, and dressed it out with a speed that embarrassed my own, using a small bone-handled knife she'd produced from somewhere. I hadn't known she had another knife. She didn't look up when I registered that fact. She just kept working. We ate the rabbit and what was left of the cornbread. The fire burned down. Stars came up over the ridge, the particular thick scatter of them you only get above 4,000 feet on a clear night, and for a while neither of us did anything but sit. Then she said something, a few words low and even. I didn't understand them. I looked at her. She said them again, slower, and pointed at the ridge to the northeast. I thought about it, said 2 days. She looked at me for a moment, then held up 3 fingers. 3 days that way. She lowered her hand. I nodded, all right, I could wait 3 days. What I was waiting for, what she was resting up for, I didn't ask. None of my business until it became my business. That's one thing the hills teach you. You don't spend your energy on what isn't yours to carry. The second day she was up before me. I woke to the fire already built and coffee heating in my tin pot, which she had found in the pack and figured out without instruction. She was crouched on the north side of the fire with her back to me, braiding her hair. The morning was cold enough that I could see her breath. She had her blanket pulled tight over her shoulders and she worked quickly, her fingers moving by habit. I lay still for a moment and watched that. Just that. A woman braiding her hair in the early morning light. I hadn't seen anything like it in so long that I had almost forgotten it was a thing that happened. I sat up and she handed me a cup of coffee without turning around. I said without thinking, "Thank you." She didn't answer, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted slightly and I thought, she heard it. Not just the words. The other thing underneath the words, which was gratitude of a kind I wasn't entirely sure how to explain. We spent that second day ranging out from camp. She knew plants I didn't, stopped to gather certain things and pass others without touching them, and I found myself watching her choices and trying to understand the logic of them. There was logic. There was always logic. She was not gathering randomly. She was selecting for things that would keep, things with specific uses, and she was leaving the rest. The discipline of it was exacting in a way I recognized from tracking. You learn to ignore what you don't need and see only what matters. It takes years to get that clean. I had a fair hand at it myself. After a while she noticed me noticing, and she pointed at a plant I'd walked past, low, grayish, growing in the shadow of a sandstone outcrop, and said something short. I looked at it. "Medicine," I tried. She shook her head, pointed at her stomach, made a small movement with her hand that I interpreted as settle. "Stomach trouble," I said. She nodded, and for the first time briefly the edge of her expression changed. Not quite a smile, an easing. We came back to camp with her blanket bundled full of gathered things. I made coffee again. She sorted through her bundles with a calm precision, this in one pile, that in another, and I noticed that she had made small trade bundles before, tied things together in particular ways, doubled the knots in a particular sequence. The kind of habits you develop when you are carrying goods for people beyond yourself. I thought about her sister, the sick child, the reason she'd ridden north in the first place. I thought about the kind of woman who rides 3 days alone through rough country because her sister's child is sick and someone needs to bring back medicine. I did not think about this out loud, but I thought it. The second night the coyotes came closer. She slept undisturbed. The third morning she moved her blanket closer to the fire, not close to me, just less far. I noticed, didn't say anything about it. The third afternoon I rode a wide loop north and east of camp, the kind of patrol I did when I was feeling watchful about something I couldn't quite name. I didn't find anything, but the feeling didn't leave me. That night she was quiet in a different way. Not closed, she'd never been particularly open, but focused inward, like someone doing a calculation. She sat with a stick tracing lines in the dirt near the fire, not aimlessly, lines with a purpose. I watched them without obviously watching them and thought, she's drawing roots. She knew she was being looked for. How she knew it I didn't ask. The hills tell you things when you know how to listen. She'd been listening all her life. I cleaned my rifle that night, slowly, the way I did when I expected to use it. The fourth morning she was up before first light. I was already up. We looked at each other across the banked coals. I said, "Today." She said nothing, but she was already rolling her blanket. On the 6th day I found the men. I'd ridden north to check a drainage I sometimes trapped, and coming back along the ridge I saw them below me in the arroyo, 4 of them, American, armed, moving slow. Not hunting, looking for something. For tracks, maybe, or for someone. I sat my horse in the cedars and watched them for a while. They had the look of men who are being paid and not paid well, which makes men careless and mean in equal measure. The one in front was reading the ground with his head down. Tracker. Not a bad one from what I could see. He moved along the drainage without overcommitting, checking side trails, coming back. The other 3 hung back and made noise with their horses and didn't know they were doing it. My gut went cold. I did not know for certain who they were looking for. But I had a strong idea, and the idea sat in my chest like a stone the whole ride back to camp. She knew something was wrong before I said a word. She was on her feet before I got off my horse, watching my face. I didn't know enough Apache to explain what I'd seen, so I held up 4 fingers, mimed a man riding, pointed north. She was still for a moment. I could see her doing the calculation, distance, direction, what they'd have seen, how long before they crossed our tracks. It took about 4 seconds. Then she started breaking camp. Fast and silent. She moved through the campsite with the economy of someone who has broken camp in a hurry before, in worse circumstances, and I found myself moving alongside her without having decided to. Rolling the bedrolls, dousing the fire, kicking dirt over the ring. She packed the food into one bundle and her own things into another, and lashed both to my horse's saddle with knots I couldn't have tied better myself. She looked at me. I looked at her. She pointed south. Her people were south. 3 days south, she'd said, and that was 6 days ago, so closer now, maybe 2 days. I said, I'm going with you. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that I couldn't name. Then she turned and started walking south, and I led my horse and followed her. That first day moving was the hardest kind of travel, fast and quiet, staying off the ridges, watching the back trail. She knew the country in a way I didn't, which surprised me and then didn't, once I started paying attention to how she moved through it. She read the terrain the way I read tracks, instinctively, without having to stop and think. She went through tight spots like water. Twice she stopped me with a hand on my horse's bridle, and both times I heard, a minute later, what she'd already heard. The second time it was riders, moving parallel to us about a quarter-mile west. We waited them out in a dry wash, crouched in the brush, my horse's nose in my hand to keep him quiet. She was very close to me in that wash, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine. She didn't move away from it, neither did I. The riders passed. We moved on. Camp that night was cold, no fire, and I gave her half my blanket because her own had been left behind in the rush. She took it without comment. We sat with our backs against the same boulder, looking out at the dark, and after a while she said something quiet that I didn't understand. The tone of it was not distress. It was more like noting something. The way a man might say out loud to no one in particular, well, this is what it is. I said, yeah. She turned and looked at me, and for a moment there was something in her face that was almost amused. Almost. A slight easing at the corners of her eyes. I felt that more than I should have. We slept sitting up, her head eventually leaning against my shoulder. I don't know when that happened. I know that when I woke, an hour or 2 before dawn, it was still there, and I did not move. Midday of the second day, she stopped at a high point and looked south, and I could tell from the change in her body, a small settling, a release, that we were getting close. Another hour and I began to see signs. A fire ring, cold, brushed over but not well enough to fool somebody looking. A length of rawhide tied around a juniper branch. She touched it as we passed without breaking stride. We came down off a long slope into a hidden valley, not wide, maybe half a mile across, with a creek running through cottonwoods and smoke rising from 3 or 4 cook fires. There were horses picketed along the creek, and children who saw us first and called out, and then a dozen people coming from the trees. She spoke rapidly to an older woman who had come first. The woman looked at me, back at her, asked something short and sharp. She answered, pointed at me. The older woman looked at me for a long moment with the particular look of someone sizing up a strange dog that another person has brought home, deciding whether it's dangerous or just lost. Then she nodded. People moved around me, not unfriendly but not welcoming, careful. I stood by my horse and let them look. 2 men came and took my rifle. I let them. If someone had ridden into my camp with an Apache woman, I'd have taken his rifle too. It was a reasonable precaution. She came back to me after a while and led me to a fire on the east side of the camp. Someone brought food, a stew of some kind with beans and dried meat, and I sat and ate and tried not to look like I was trying to figure out the fastest way out, which I wasn't, but I know that was probably what I looked like. She sat across from me and ate too. Later, through a young man of about 16 who knew some English, I learned some of what had happened. She had ridden north to find a healer for her sister's sick child. She had gotten turned around in a storm and ended up far east of where she'd meant to be. Her horse had thrown her. She had been alone 2 days before I found her, which explained the particular quality of her watchfulness that first afternoon. She had been weighing her odds for a while before I came blundering into the picture. The men on our trail were land agents, or men doing land agent work, which in those days meant almost anything. There was a survey going on in the region, which in those days also meant almost anything. The camp had been watching them for a week. I sat with this for a while. Then I asked the boy to tell her something for me. I said, the men tracking her were moving south as of yesterday. If they hadn't found the camp yet, they were likely going to find it in the next day or two. And I said, I know this country better than those men. If they needed someone to lead the camp further west, away from the survey line, I could do that. The boy translated. She listened without expression. Then she spoke for a while and the boy translated back. She said she would bring it to the council. She said to wait. I waited. The answer came back the next morning. Yes, they would take my offer. One of their own men would ride with me. We would find the route and come back for the camp. I want to say I did it purely from decency. That's mostly true. But there was also the simple fact that I wanted another day where she was present. Another day where I might learn one more word of her language, or watch her move through the cottonwoods, or see the way she was with the children, patient and direct, and without a drop of false sentiment, exactly the way she was with me. She rode with us, her and the camp's man, whose name I never got quite right and whose riding I had no complaint about. The 4 of us, me, him, her, and my horse, went west through a broken pass I'd crossed twice before, and I found what I was looking for. A canyon hidden behind a fold in the hills, with water and grass and only 2 approaches, both defensible. A winter camp if it needed to be. On the way back she rode beside me, rather than ahead or behind. I said, in the handful of Apache words I'd picked up, the one for good, and pointed at the canyon. She said something in return. I didn't understand it, but the tone was a yes. Then she said something else and looked at me sideways, and the young man riding on my left translated without being asked. She says you ride like someone who has been alone a long time. I thought about that. I said that's accurate. He translated. She nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. The camp moved the next day. I helped where I could and stayed out of the way where I couldn't, which is the same skill in different clothes. By evening they were established in the canyon, and the old approaches were covered by 2 men I never heard move. That night they let me have my rifle back. I should have ridden north the next morning. I knew it. My horse knew it. He was looking the direction of home every time I let him drop his head. I had a lined shack that needed winterizing and 40 miles between me and it. I stayed 3 more days. On the second of those days, her sister's child, who was 3 years old and had been sick when she'd left on her ride, took a fever. The healer worked through the night, and I sat outside the fire because there was nothing I could do, but I also wasn't going to sleep. Around 2 in the morning she came and sat beside me, not close, but near enough that I could hear her breathing. She didn't speak. I didn't speak. We just sat. The child's fever broke near dawn. She let out a breath I could hear. I felt myself let out the same one. She said something. I looked at the fire. She said something else, shorter, and touched my arm. I looked at her then. She held my eyes for a moment, long enough that I felt something shift in my chest like a plate of shale giving way. Then she said in English, the first English I'd heard from her, "Thank you." I went still. "You speak English?" I said. A pause. Some. "Since when?" "Since the beginning." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about all the things I'd said in the past 10 days, out loud to myself, in the habit of a man who has lived alone so long that he has stopped distinguishing between thinking and saying. I thought about what she must have heard. I went through it briefly, and then stopped going through it because it was embarrassing enough the first time around. I said, "That explains some things." She said, "Yes." I could hear something in her voice that I think was amusement. The same small thing I'd seen at the corners of her eyes in the cold wash 3 days back. "Okay," I said, "all right." "You are not angry?" "No." "Why not?" I thought about it. Seems like a reasonable thing to do, not trust a man you just met, take your time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did not have to come south." "No." "Why did you?" I looked at the fire. "Seemed like the right thing," I said. Another pause. The fire had burned down to coals and the canyon was very quiet. "Seemed like," she said. "Or was?" I looked at her then. She was watching me with the same quality of attention she'd had from the beginning, that hawk's directness, the thing that sees right through the outside of a thing to whatever is underneath. I felt it like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. "Was," I said. She nodded, as if she'd been waiting for me to find the right word. I stayed 6 more days after that. There was no single moment when that decision was made, no conversation about it. It simply happened the way winter happens, by accumulation, day after day of small things that add up to something you can't take apart. I helped reinforce one of the canyon walls that was loose with runoff. I tracked and shot 2 mule deer that fed the camp for several days. I showed 2 of the men a way through the western pass that shaved half a day off their route to the water source I'd identified. I fixed the camp's only working rifle, which had a fouled breech, using tools I made from what I had in my saddlebag. I did not make a ceremony of any of it. I just did the work that was in front of me. The men of the camp were not warm to me. They were measured and watchful, which I respected. The older woman, Nijoni's mother, I eventually understood, looked at me every morning like she was still doing the calculation, and I did not try to hurry her along. You can't rush a person's judgment of you. Either you are what you seem or you're not, and time is the only thing that proves it. The children were fascinated by my horse, and by the way I made cornbread in a flat pan, which they found inexplicably amusing. 2 of the boys, about 10 and 12, started showing up near my fire in the evenings without any stated reason, just sitting there in the way children sit near a thing they want to study. I didn't chase them off. After a while, the 10-year-old started handing me wood without being asked, and I stopped keeping track of how many evenings he'd been doing it. She and I talked in the evenings. Carefully at first, her English and my handful of Apache words building something between us that wasn't quite either language. She told me things about where her people had been and where they were going. She asked me things about the land to the north and west, the water sources and the passes, the movements of the men who were surveying. She was gathering information. I understood intelligence, you might call it. A practical woman doing a practical thing. But there were other conversations. About the hills. About the way a certain hawk hunted a certain canyon. About the smell of snow coming 2 days before it arrives, which we had apparently both noticed for the same reasons without ever having discussed it with anyone before, because the people around us had never paid that kind of attention. One evening she told me about her husband, who had been killed 4 years before. She said it plainly, the way people say things that they have had time to live with and make into a settled shape. She said he was a good man. She said she missed him. She said she had stopped expecting to feel anything like that again. I said nothing for a while. Then I said my wife had left 12 years before, not died, left, walked away, which was its own kind of loss. Gone back to her people in Missouri. She hadn't been wrong to go. I wasn't what she needed. But it had taken me a long time to understand that, and longer still to stop blaming myself for it. By the time I understood it, the habit of alone had settled into me so deep I'd stopped noticing it. Like grit in a collar. After a while you forget it's there. She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I'm here." She looked at me with that quality of attention that I was beginning to understand was just how she looked at things she was deciding about. The hawk look. The weighing look. She said, "Yes, you are here." On the 9th morning, I saddled my horse. I had winterizing to do, and the window was getting narrow. I couldn't stay forever, and we both knew it, and there was no dignified way to pretend otherwise. She was there when I was ready. The camp was going about its business behind her. Her mother stood at the edge of the cottonwoods watching, which I had come to understand was how the woman did everything from a distance, without appearing to look. She handed me something, a folded piece of hide with something drawn on it in charcoal. When I opened it, it was a map. The canyon's location, the route back north, 2 water sources I hadn't known about, and a pass to the west that I could see, looking at it, would cut a full day off the approach to my line shack. I folded it and put it in my coat. I said, "Nijoni." She looked at me. I said, "Thank you for the map," for I stopped. Some things don't have good endings in English either. She stepped forward and put both hands flat on my chest, the way I had sometimes seen the women of the camp greet each other. Not a hug. Something more deliberate than that. A placing of hands. A marking. She held them there for a moment, and I felt the weight of them through my coat, through everything, the way you sometimes feel the cold of a stone through a glove. I put one hand over hers briefly, then she stepped back. I swung up onto my horse. I was about 200 yards up the north approach when I heard her call something. I turned. She was standing at the canyon mouth, small in the distance, and she called it again. I didn't understand the word, but I raised my hand and she raised hers. I rode north. I spent the winter in the shack, same as always. Snowed in for 6 weeks in January, which suited me fine. I had enough wood and enough food and enough to think about to last me the whole dark span of it. I thought about the map, which I had pinned to the wall beside the window. I thought about the water sources I hadn't known and the Western Pass. I thought about the weight of her hands on my chest and the way that it felt, not like something soft, not like something I needed to be careful with, but like something solid, like contact between 2 things that could each hold their own weight. I thought about the morning she'd had the coffee hot before I was up. I thought about her dressing out the rabbit with that bone-handled knife, quick and clean and without any fuss. I thought about the 2 of us crouched in the cold wash with the riders passing 50 yards away, and how neither of us had moved and neither of us had needed to tell the other to be still. I thought about what it was like to be competent alongside someone else who was competent. To move through hard country with another person and not have to slow down or explain. I had forgotten that was a thing that could exist. The snow came in waves through January and February, and I cut wood and kept the horses and read the 2 books I owned until I had them memorized and didn't think, most of the time, about going south. I thought about it all the time. In March I rode south. I am not a man who gives himself a great deal of permission to want things. I spent most of my life convincing myself that I didn't need much, and that what I didn't need I didn't miss. That is a useful way to think when you are alone and winter is long and there isn't enough wood. It is less useful when the snow melts and you keep pinning a piece of charcoal marked hide to every wall you live in, and you keep thinking about the way someone looked at you across a fire and made you feel, for a few days, like a man who was doing the right thing and being seen doing it. I took the western pass she'd drawn on the map. It cut the travel exactly as she'd indicated, a day shorter, a better grade, a reliable seep spring halfway through. I stopped at the spring and watered my horse and sat for a moment in the afternoon light and thought, she put this on the map for me. She put this here because she knew I would come back. Or maybe she put it on the map because it was a useful thing to know, and she was a practical woman. Both of those things could be true at the same time. That's the kind of person she was. I found the canyon on the second afternoon. The camp was there. Changed some, reorganized, better settled in, new walls on the wind side, the horse line moved to better grass. Children saw me first, same as before. One of them, a boy of about 7, came running toward me shouting something I didn't understand. Then she was there. She came through the cottonwoods from the direction of the creek, and she stopped when she saw me and just stood for a moment. I sat my horse and looked at her. She looked at me. Then she said, "You came back." I said I might. "You did not say that." "I meant to." She looked at me for another moment. There was something in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite not one. "You need food," she said. "I could eat." She turned and walked toward the fire, and I got down from my horse and followed. The old woman was there. She looked at me for the longest moment yet, doing her calculation. Then she said something short and definitive and went back to her work. I looked at the boy who sometimes translated. She says you are slow. I thought about that. I said she's right. He translated that too, and the old woman, not looking up, said something that sounded sharp and was apparently funny, because several people laughed, including the boy. I looked at Najoni. She was watching me with that look, the one that weighs, except now there was something settled in it that hadn't been there in October, something that had made a decision. She said in English, "She says slow, but you came. That is more than most." I sat down at the fire. That was spring. I will not build this up into something it wasn't. It was not smooth. It was not simple. Her people had reasons, good ones, to be cautious about a white man wanting to stay in their vicinity, and I had to earn that tolerance over time in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes humiliating and sometimes plain hard work. I was learning a language that did not come easily to a man of my age, and there were long stretches where I felt like a child for the slowness of it. There were men in the camp who never quite trusted me, and I don't hold that against them. They were right to be careful. The old woman, her name was Shia, or close enough, took the longest. She watched me for months the way you watch weather, looking for the sign that tells you which way it's going to go. She put me to work, which I think was partially a test, and partially because she was a practical woman who saw that I was strong and available. I cut wood and hauled water and repaired things and tracked game, and did not complain about any of it, because it was good work and I was good at it, and it was the only language I had in those early months that was better than my Apache. One of the camp's men, the one who'd ridden with me to find the winter canyon, whose name I eventually got right, which was Nantai, became something like a colleague, not a friend exactly. More like the kind of man you work alongside and trust in the field and don't need to make small talk with. We tracked together 3 times that summer. He was better than me in the places he knew, and I was better in the places I knew, and we were honest with each other about which was which. That is the whole foundation of a working partnership, in my experience. By midsummer, he'd stopped watching my back trail when we rode out. That is the best measure I know of trust between men, not what they say, but whether they stop watching where you've been. The survey men came back once in June. 3 of them this time, with a government man in a coat too heavy for the heat. They rode along the valley's northern edge without finding the canyon approach, which wasn't an accident. Nantai had shifted the camp's fire smoke pattern a month before, so it drifted west rather than rising straight, and the canyon mouth was brushed over in a way that looked natural from 200 yards. I rode out to meet the government man on the flat and told him I was a trapper working water sources, and that the country to the south was hard going and not worth the survey time. He believed me, or decided to. They rode east the next morning. That evening Nijoni looked at me for a long moment across the fire and said, in the quiet way she said most things, "You lied for us." I told him what he needed to hear to go away. She thought about that. "Is that different?" "Probably not," I said. "But he had no business being here, and I had every reason to keep him away from here, and I'd do it again." She was quiet, then she said, "Good." That was the first time she'd used that word with me, the way I'd used it with her that first week, as something deliberate, a verdict. Nijoni and I moved toward each other slowly, the way two people move who have both been hurt and are not going to be careless about it. We talked mostly. We worked alongside each other. She taught me the plants of the canyon the way you teach something important, in pieces over time, not all at once. I taught her the weather signs I'd learned in the hills. We argued once seriously about the best route around a particular ridge, and she was right, which I acknowledged, and she was not gracious about it at all, which I found mysteriously to be one of the things I liked best about her. I had spent so many years around people who told me what they thought I wanted to hear, or said nothing at all, that a woman who would look me in the eye and tell me I was wrong, and explain why, in 2 sentences, and then drop it and move on, was something I did not know how to value at first and then couldn't stop valuing. In August the horses got into something, a plant, or maybe bad water from a seep-up canyon, I was never sure, and 3 of them went down within 2 days, shaking and off their feed and lying flat in a way that worried me badly. Horses are not easy to read when they're sick. They hide it as long as they can, which means by the time you know something's wrong you're already behind it. I had dealt with horse sickness before. Not this exact presentation, but something close enough. A bloat situation on the Brazos 20 years back that had cost a man his whole remuda because nobody moved fast enough. I knew what moving fast enough looked like. I spent 3 days almost without sleep. Walked the sick horses on a line to keep them from lying flat too long. Got clean water into them a cup at a time. Nantai worked alongside me the first day and then deferred. He knew horses, but he could see that I knew this particular thing, and he was a smart enough man to step back when someone else knew better. That kind of intelligence, the willingness to cede ground when someone else has the skill, is rarer than people think. On the 3rd evening, the worst of the 3, a roan mare about 15 years old who'd been going down hardest, got up on her own and stood at the water line and drank. I leaned against the canyon wall and let out a breath I'd been holding since Tuesday. Nijoni brought me food, sat down beside me while I ate it. She didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there in the late afternoon light with her hands around a cup of something hot, watching the horses. Then she said, "How did you know what to do?" I thought about the Brazos, about watching a man lose 20 horses because he didn't walk them, didn't water them small, didn't keep them on their feet. About learning the thing from the tragedy of it. I said, "Watch someone do it wrong once." She nodded. That was an answer she understood. She said, "The camp would have lost 3 horses." "Maybe." "Not maybe," she said. 3 horses. She said it the way you say something when you want it heard as a fact, not an opinion. The camp runs on horses. 3 horses is not a small number when the winter is coming. I said, "They're up now." "Yes," she said, "because of you." I looked at the canyon wall. There was a hawk working the thermals up above the rim, riding the late heat without moving its wings. You don't have to say that, I said. I know I do not have to, she said. I am saying it because it is true. I didn't have an answer for that. She went back to watching the horses, and I went back to eating, and the hawk went on riding the heat, and the canyon evening settled around us in the way that canyon evenings do, slowly, the light going amber and then long and then gone. That was the evening I understood that she wasn't going to give me anything I hadn't earned. Not her trust, not her good opinion, not her company. Everything she'd given me so far had been earned, piece by piece, and she was going to go on doing it that way. The map had been earned. The evening's talking had been earned. The way she called me back when I rode out checking had been earned. A woman like that, when she tells you something is true, it's true. There's no flattery in it, no managing of you, just the thing as it is. That was, I realized, exactly what I needed and hadn't known I needed. Not softness, not comfort, evidence. Someone whose good opinion you can actually trust because they don't give it away. One evening in late summer, we were sitting by the creek in the cottonwoods, and she said, without looking at me, that if I wanted to stay through the winter she would not object. I said I would like to stay. She said, then stay. There was a pause. The creek was low and the cottonwood leaves were turning, that particular dry gold they get in early September. She was watching the water. I was watching her watching it. I said, why? She looked at me, why what? Why do you want me to stay? She was quiet for a moment, not working out the answer. She knew the answer. Working out whether to say it. She said, you do not leave things undone. I thought about that for a while. That was, in a handful of words, maybe the truest thing anyone had ever said about me. And I'd had to come 51 years and lose most of what I'd had and ride into the Sonora Hills alone in October to find someone who saw it. All right, I said, I'll stay. That night she said something to me directly, first time she'd done that. I had 3 words of it at most. I looked at the boy. He said, she says, you are less stupid than you look. High praise, I said. He translated that too. She gave a short sound that might have been a laugh, then she walked away. That fall, I did not go back to my line shack. I sent word with a man I trusted in Yucca, crossing to check on it through the winter. I don't know what he made of that, and I don't much care. By October, I had built a small structure at the east end of the canyon, separate from the main camp, which was the right thing, and everyone understood it to be the right thing without it being discussed. Close enough to be useful, far enough to be mine. I used the same cedar and river stone method I'd used for my line shack, and the 10-year-old boy and his brother helped me carry stone for 2 days without being asked. I paid them in cornbread, which I was making more of by then. The old woman had produced a proper iron pan from somewhere and left it near my fire one morning without comment, and I chose to receive it in the spirit in which I believed it was given. The winter was hard. 2 of the camp's elders died, one in November and one in February, and there was a period of grieving that I did not know how to move through, and so I just stayed and did what I could do, cut wood, kept the horses through the cold, made myself useful in the ways that had nothing to do with words. I sat with the men at night and followed what they were doing without understanding most of it. I kept the fires going. I brought in 2 deer in December when the camp stores were getting thin, and I did it quietly and without making anything of it, which I think was the right call. There were nights that winter when I lay awake in my small stone room listening to the canyon wind and thought, what are you doing? What exactly are you doing, Cal? You are a 51-year-old man with a line shack 40 miles north and a way of life you built deliberately and alone, and you are sleeping in a canyon in the Sonora Hills with people whose language you can barely speak and whose customs you are learning one piece at a time, like a child. And the answer that came back every time was, this is the most I have been useful in years. This is the most I have felt like myself. Those 2 things turned out to be the same thing. I hadn't known that before. Now I did. There was a night in January during the deep cold when one of the canyon walls started to give. I woke to a sound I didn't immediately place, a low groaning, almost geological, the sound of weight on the move. I was out of my blankets before I was fully awake, the way you get when you've spent enough years in rough country to let the body make the first decision. It was the south wall, the one I'd worked on in the spring. The freeze-thaw had gotten into a crack I'd thought we'd packed well, and the crack had opened and a 12-foot section was moving. Slow, but moving. Below it, one of the camp's storage shelters. I woke Nantai. We didn't have time for language. I showed him what I saw and he saw it, and we were in motion. Got rope around the section, used 2 of the horses as anchors, propped the base with cedar posts we cut fast in the dark with axes. It was 4 hours of cold, hard work, and at the end of it the wall was stopped. Nijoni had been there most of it, not holding rope, not in the way, but there. Present the way she was always present, attentive, watching, ready. When we drove the last post and stood back and the wall did not move, she was standing a few feet behind me with a lamp, and the lamplight was the only warm thing in the canyon, and she was holding it steady. I was cold through to the back teeth. My hands were shaking from the cold and the work. She stepped forward and took my hands in hers and held them. Not a gesture. Just warmth. Just the direct, practical thing she always did. She saw what was needed and provided it. I let her hold them until they stopped shaking. In the morning, Shia came and looked at the wall and then looked at me for a long moment. She said something. I had enough by then to get most of it. She said, "You saved the food." I said in Apache, uncertain of my conjugation, "Nantai helped." She said, "Nantai helped. You knew there is a difference." She walked away. I thought about that all morning. The difference between helping and knowing. The difference between being present and being the one who saw it coming. I had spent my whole life knowing things. Weather, terrain, animal behavior. The way a herd moves before a storm. The way a man's horse tells you his mood before his face does. The way a sound at 3 in the morning means what it means. I had spent that whole life knowing things in solitude, which makes the knowing useful but also somehow weightless. If nobody is going to benefit from what you know, what is knowing for? For the first time in as long as I could remember, my knowing had counted for something. The food was still there. The horses were alive. The wall was standing. That felt like something I had needed to feel and hadn't had a name for until now. Nijoni moved through that winter with a steadiness that I watched closely, because I was trying to learn something from it about how to be present in a place where you are not the center. That is harder than it sounds. For a man who has been alone a long time, every room he enters is organized around him by default, because he is the only person in it. Learning to enter a room that is organized around someone else's grief, someone else's loss, someone else's dead, and to be useful there without making it about yourself. That took more than I had expected, and I did not always manage it. But I tried, and the trying was visible, and visible effort counts for something when words are slow. In February she came and sat beside me one night and said, in English and then in Apache, both, so I would have it both ways, "You are a good man." I did not say anything for a long time. She said, "That is a compliment." I said, "I know." She said, "You do not believe it." I thought about that. The fire had burned low, and outside the wind was moving through the canyon with a long, slow sound. I thought about the 12 years I'd spent alone after Missouri, and what I'd told myself about why, and how much of it was true, and how much of it was just the story you tell yourself when you stop expecting anything different. "I'm working on it," I said. She looked at me with that weighing look, and then she did something she had not done before. She took my hand, both of hers around it, the way her mother had greeted the returning hunters. A claiming, a recognition. She held it for a long moment, and I felt something come loose in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could say. Not a soft thing. A solid thing, The feeling of a door opening onto a room you'd stopped expecting to find. Air in a place that had gotten close. I turned my hand and held hers back. She let me. "I am glad you sat down on the rock," she said. "Yeah," I said, "so am I." Outside, snow was coming down in the cedars. I could hear it. The particular quiet of it, that particular weight on the air. The fire had burned low and the canyon was dark, and I was 51 years old, which is old enough to know when something is what it is and young enough to be surprised by it. I sat there with her hand in mine and the snow coming down, and I did not think about Missouri or the line shack or the men on the survey or any of the things that had made up my life up to that October, when I'd gone up into the hills to hunt and come down with something I hadn't gone looking for. I sat there, and I was exactly where I was. That, it turns out, is the whole of it.